There's something strange that happens when you stop chasing a narcissist. They come alive. Not because they suddenly remember how much they love you, but because your absence does something to them that your constant presence never could. It disturbs a psychological pattern they have relied on for years. It interrupts a dynamic that allowed them to feel secure, powerful, and in control. Suddenly, the emotional script they expected you to follow changes, and that change forces them to confront something they desperately try to avoid. I want to talk about that today, not as a trick, not as a secret formula for getting someone back, not as another manipulation tactic disguised as self-help. Those approaches only keep people trapped in unhealthy cycles. Instead, I want to explain what is actually happening beneath the surface, because once you truly understand it, something remarkable occurs. You stop seeing their reactions as proof that they love you. You stop interpreting every text message, every sudden apology, every unexpected appearance as a sign that destiny is bringing you back together. Most importantly, you stop giving their behavior the power to define your worth. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about narcissistic relationships is that the narcissist leaves because they stop caring. While that can certainly happen, many narcissistic relationships don't end because love disappears. They end because control becomes more important than connection. The relationship is no longer about two people growing together. It becomes about maintaining a system where one person constantly receives attention, validation, admiration, or emotional reassurance while giving very little genuine vulnerability in return. As long as you continue chasing, explaining, forgiving, apologizing, or trying to fix everything, that system keeps functioning exactly as they expect. Even when they criticize you, ignore you, or create emotional distance, they know you'll eventually return. They know you'll reach out. They know you'll try harder. From their perspective, nothing has really changed. The emotional supply continues, the reassurance continues, the certainty continues. Your pursuit becomes part of the environment, almost like background noise they no longer consciously notice because they assume it will always be there. This is why so many people stay confused. They think the narcissist looks calm because they're emotionally healthy. They're not. They're calm because the situation remains predictable. Predictability creates comfort. Control creates comfort. Certainty creates comfort. The moment you stop chasing, however, something unexpected happens. The script changes, the emotional environment shifts, the certainty disappears. For perhaps the first time in a long time, they no longer know what you're thinking. They no longer know whether you're still waiting. They no longer know whether you'll answer if they call. They no longer know whether they've truly lost access to you. That uncertainty can be deeply uncomfortable for someone whose sense of self depends heavily on controlling how other people respond. Notice something important here. This isn't necessarily about missing you, it's about losing predictability. Healthy love misses the person. Unhealthy attachment often misses the role the person played. There's a tremendous difference between those two experiences. Someone can miss the comfort you provided without actually respecting you. Someone can miss your attention without appreciating your heart. Someone can miss your availability without being willing to build a healthy relationship. Understanding this distinction protects you from one of the most common mistakes people make after leaving emotionally manipulative relationships. They mistake renewed attention for genuine transformation. The narcissist suddenly begins texting. They check your social media. They ask mutual friends about you. They send nostalgic memories. They apologize. They promise change. They suddenly remember birthdays they forgot. They become surprisingly affectionate. And because you've spent months or years starving for exactly this kind of attention, it feels almost impossible not to interpret it as proof that everything you've ever wanted is finally happening. But timing matters. Real growth usually begins during accountability. Manipulation usually begins during loss of control. Those two things can look remarkably similar on the surface. Both involve contact. Both involve emotion. Both involve promises. But underneath, the motivations are often completely different. Someone who has genuinely changed accepts responsibility, even if reconciliation never happens. Someone who simply wants control back usually becomes frustrated the moment they realize they can't immediately regain influence. Pay attention to what happens when you maintain healthy boundaries. That is where the truth usually reveals itself. If your boundaries are respected consistently, there may be room for cautious optimism. If your boundaries trigger anger, guilt trips, blame, silent treatment, or attempts to pressure you, then the old dynamic hasn't disappeared. It's simply wearing different clothes. Many survivors describe something that initially seems confusing. They say, "The kinder I became, the worse they treated me." This isn't because kindness is weakness. It's because kindness without boundaries becomes predictable. When someone knows they can repeatedly hurt you without meaningful consequences, your forgiveness stops being experienced as generosity. It becomes expected. Expected kindness loses its emotional impact. Unexpected independence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty captures attention. Think about the emotional economy operating inside many narcissistic relationships. Your attention has value. Your reactions have value. Your emotions have value. Your time has value. As long as those resources flow toward them automatically, they rarely stop to appreciate them. People often overlook what feels guaranteed. It's only when the supply is interrupted that its absence becomes impossible to ignore. This explains why some narcissists suddenly appear obsessed after months of indifference. They're not responding to your suffering, they're responding to your absence. They're responding to the fact that the emotional resources they counted on no longer arrive on schedule. Again, that doesn't automatically mean they love you. It means something changed, and human beings naturally notice change. One of the hardest realities to accept is that narcissistic relationships often condition people to believe love must always be earned. You begin believing that if you just become more patient, more understanding, more attractive, less emotional, or more forgiving, then eventually you'll receive the consistency you've been longing for. But healthy love doesn't operate like a reward system. You shouldn't have to constantly prove your value just to receive basic respect. When someone only treats you well after you begin walking away, ask yourself a difficult question. Why was your pain never enough? Why did your tears accomplish nothing? Why did your repeated conversations produce no lasting change? Why did your exhaustion go unnoticed? Yet suddenly, the possibility of losing access to you creates urgency. That question deserves honest reflection, because urgency isn't always love. Sometimes urgency is fear, fear of losing influence, fear of losing admiration, fear of losing emotional security, fear of losing someone who consistently validated their identity, and fear can produce behavior that temporarily resembles affection. This is why people often experience what therapists sometimes describe as intermittent reinforcement. Long periods of neglect are suddenly interrupted by moments of extraordinary warmth. Those brief moments feel incredibly powerful because they arrive after emotional deprivation. Your brain begins associating rare affection with hope. You start believing that if you wait just a little longer, the loving version of them will stay. Unfortunately, the cycle usually repeats. Distance, affection, withdrawal, reconnection, confusion, hope, disappointment. Over and over again. Each cycle strengthens the emotional bond, not because the relationship is healthy, but because unpredictability creates powerful psychological attachment. Breaking that cycle often feels less like leaving a person and more like recovering from an addiction. Not because the love was fake. Your love may have been very real. Your investment was real. Your memories were real. Your dreams were real. But the emotional conditioning was real too. And healing requires separating those two realities. Another reason narcissists often become more active when you stop chasing is because silence removes information. When you constantly explain yourself, they always know where they stand. They know your fears. They know your hopes. They know exactly which words affect you. Silence changes all of that. Suddenly, they have to imagine what you're doing instead of knowing. They have to wonder whether you've met someone else. They have to wonder whether you finally accepted the truth. They have to wonder whether you've become emotionally unavailable to them. Ironically, the uncertainty they've created for other people throughout their lives is now directed back toward them. And many narcissistic personalities struggle intensely with uncertainty because uncertainty means they no longer control the narrative. That's why some will suddenly attempt to rewrite history. They'll remind you of the good memories while ignoring the painful ones. They'll say you misunderstood them. They'll minimize the hurt they caused. They'll focus on isolated acts of kindness while dismissing repeated patterns of disrespect. This isn't always a deliberate lie. Sometimes it's a defense mechanism that protects them from confronting a version of themselves they don't want to see. Accepting full responsibility would require genuine self-examination, and that can feel profoundly threatening to someone whose identity depends on maintaining an image of superiority or innocence. But regardless of whether it's intentional or unconscious, The effect on you is often the same. You begin questioning your own memory. You wonder whether you exaggerated. You start thinking maybe it wasn't really that bad. Then you remember the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the constant self-doubt, the emotional exhaustion, the feeling that you were slowly disappearing inside the relationship. Your body often remembers what your mind tries to forget. Trust that wisdom. Healing doesn't happen because the narcissist finally understands what they lost. Healing happens because you finally understand what you were losing while trying to keep them. You were losing your confidence, your peace, your sense of identity, your emotional stability, sometimes even your ability to trust your own intuition. The greatest victory isn't making a narcissist regret losing you. The greatest victory is reaching the point where whether they regret it or not no longer determines your happiness. That is real freedom. Because when you stop chasing, something much more important than their reaction begins to happen. You start chasing yourself. You start rebuilding the parts of your life that were neglected. You reconnect with friends. You rediscover hobbies. You laugh without wondering whether someone will criticize you for it. You make decisions without fearing someone's emotional punishment. Little by little, your nervous system begins to relax. You realize that peace feels unfamiliar, not because it's wrong, but because chaos had become normal. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all. The narcissist may come alive when you stop chasing. They may text, they may call, they may promise, they may reminisce, they may even appear transformed for a while. But the question that matters isn't whether they come back. The question is whether you have become someone who no longer needs to sacrifice your self-respect to keep another person close. Because the moment you stop measuring your value by their attention, you take back the one thing they could never truly own, your sense of self. That is the beginning of genuine healing. That is the moment the cycle finally loses its grip. And once you experience the quiet strength that comes from choosing your own peace over someone else's approval, you discover something far more valuable than getting a narcissist's attention. You discover that the life you were trying so desperately to build through another person's validation was waiting inside you all along. From that place, you no longer chase people who repeatedly diminish your spirit. You choose relationships where respect is consistent, love is mutual, accountability is welcomed, and your presence is valued without having to be earned over and over again. That is not only how you recover from a narcissistic relationship, it is how you ensure that your future is no longer defined by one. Here's the first thing to know. A narcissist isn't chasing you. They're chasing a feeling. Early on, that might look identical to love. The texts, the attention, the way they make you feel like the only person in the room. But underneath it, what they're actually addicted to is the pursuit itself. The uncertainty, the small ache of not quite having you yet. The moment that ache disappears, so does their interest, and it has almost nothing to do with who you are as a person. Think about it from the outside for a second. Why would someone who claims to want closeness feel bored the instant they get it? Why would stability feel like a letdown instead of a relief? That's not how a securely attached person operates. For most people, closeness is the reward. For a narcissist, closeness is the end of the game, and the end of the game means there's nothing left to win, so they engineer distance. Sometimes, without even realizing they're doing it, they pull back right when things get warm. They create little tests, little doubts, little moments of coldness, just enough to reopen the gap they need in order to feel that pull again. If you've ever been in this dynamic, you've probably felt like you were on an emotional treadmill, sprinting to close a distance that kept reappearing no matter how hard you tried. Now, here's the part that took me a long time to really understand. This isn't random cruelty. It's not that they're simply bored or selfish. Although it can look that way from the outside, it's rooted in something much older and much more fragile, a belief buried so deep they'd probably deny it if you asked them directly, that they are not actually lovable as they are. Not the polished version. Not the confident, charming, successful version they present to the world. The real one. Underneath all of that. That belief is unbearable to sit with. So instead of facing it, they build something else to live inside. An image. Sometimes it's the life of the party. Sometimes it's the wounded soul who's been hurt by everyone. Sometimes it's the high achiever who never needs anyone. The costume changes, but the function is the same. Distract from what's underneath and make sure nobody gets close enough to check. This is where it gets almost paradoxical. If somewhere inside they know the image is a performance, then genuine love directed at them doesn't feel like relief, it feels like danger. Because if you love the mask, then you're not really loving them, and they know it. And if you tried to love what's underneath, they'd have to actually show you what's underneath, which is the one thing they've built their entire identity around avoiding. So real affection doesn't land the way you'd expect. Instead of softening them, it can make them suspicious, restless, even irritated. You did everything right, you were consistent, warm, honest, and instead of drawing them closer, it seemed to push them away. That's not a coincidence, and it's not something you did wrong. You simply offered something their internal system isn't built to receive. There's another layer to this that's honestly a little heartbreaking if you sit with it. The very qualities that first attracted them to you, your warmth, your empathy, your capacity to actually be present with another person, are things they don't have access to in themselves anymore. Somewhere along the way, usually a long time before you ever met them, they made a trade. They gave up their own emotional openness in exchange for control, protection, armor. And now, watching you move through the world with that openness intact stirs up two conflicting feelings at once, wanting it and resenting you for having what they sacrificed. That's why the dynamic can feel so confusing from your side. One moment, you're being idealized, put on a pedestal, told you're different from everyone else they've known. The next, you're being subtly punished for the same qualities that got you the pedestal in the first place. It's not that they're lying about admiring you, it's that admiration and resentment are sitting right next to each other in them, and depending on the day, either one might be steering. So what actually happens when you pull back? Not as a strategy, but because you've genuinely started protecting your own energy, something in their internal wiring reads it as a threat, not to the relationship necessarily, but to their sense of self. Remember, their whole identity depends on being wanted, being chased, being the center of someone's emotional world. When you stop performing that role for them, it doesn't just remove a source of comfort. It removes a mirror they were using to convince themselves they're worthy. Without that mirror, they're left looking at the thing they've spent their whole life running from, themselves, without an audience. That's genuinely intolerable for a lot of people wired this way. And so they do what they've always done. They try to force the mirror back into place. Sometimes that looks like begging. Sometimes it looks like fake apologies and grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like showing up in your life again out of nowhere, almost like clockwork, right as you've started to feel okay without them. That timing isn't a coincidence either. It's not that they've been thinking about you nonstop and finally worked up the courage to reach out. It's usually the opposite. Some part of them senses, almost like a radar going off that you're no longer orbiting them. And that loss of gravity is what triggers the reappearance. Not longing, not growth, not remorse. I think this is the part people struggling with this kind of relationship find hardest to accept because it sounds so cold. It would be easier in some ways if they really were just chasing you out of love that got complicated, but the truth is usually less personal than that, and honestly, once you can accept how impersonal it is, it stops hurting quite as much. You weren't rejected because you weren't good enough. You were discarded because you stopped being useful to a system that was never really about you in the first place. Let's talk about what happens on your end because this matters just as much. When you keep engaging, explaining yourself, trying to fix things, reacting to every provocation, you're unintentionally feeding exactly what keeps this cycle alive. Every reaction, even an angry one, even a hurt one, confirms to them that they still have influence over you. And influence to someone operating this way feels almost like proof that they exist. That's a strange thing to sit with. Your pain, your confusion, your late night texts trying to understand what happened, these aren't just collateral damage in the relationship. For a lot of narcissists, they're actually the point, even if they'd never admit that to themselves. Emotional chaos becomes evidence of their own importance. If they can make you feel something that intensely, then they matter. Calm, on the other hand, feels like being erased. This is why indifference does something that anger or heartbreak never could. Anger is still a reaction. Heartbreak is still attention, in its own painful way. But real indifference, the quiet, steady kind that comes from genuinely detaching, not performing detachment to get a reaction. That's the one thing their system has no idea how to process. There's no hook for them to grab onto, no emotional charge to feed off, just silence, and inside, That silence, nothing reflecting back to them who they've convinced themselves they are. I want to be careful here because I'm not saying act indifferent so they'll come crawling back to you. That's just another version of the game. And honestly, if that's the goal, you're still handing them power, just wearing a different mask yourself. What I'm describing is different. It's the indifference that comes naturally once you've actually done the internal work of letting go, once their opinion of you, their presence in your life, their validation simply stops being something you need. That kind of detachment isn't a performance, it's a byproduct of healing. And ironically, it's also the version that unsettles them the most because it can't be seen through or countered. You're not punishing them with silence. You're just no longer available as a source of supply, and there's nothing they can do to negotiate their way back into that role. If you're in the middle of this or coming out the other side of it, here's something worth holding on to. The chasing was never really about you as a whole complex person. It was about a role you were playing in someone else's unresolved story. The audience, the mirror, the proof of desirability. When you stop playing that role, some of them will try harder to pull you back in, at least for a while. Others will simply move on to someone new who hasn't caught on yet. Either way, the outcome for you is the same. You get your life back. It's tempting, in the aftermath of something like this, to want closure, an explanation, an apology, some acknowledgement that what happened was real and that it hurt. I understand that longing completely, but I gently push back on waiting for it, because the same reasons they couldn't offer real intimacy in the relationship are the reasons they usually can't offer real accountability afterward either. Both require the same thing: stepping outside the false self they've built their whole identity around and allowing another human being to see who they really are underneath it. That sounds simple on the surface, but psychologically, it can feel terrifying. The false self isn't just a mask they put on for certain situations. Over time, it often becomes the identity they depend on to feel safe, admired, and emotionally protected. They have spent years, sometimes decades, carefully constructing an image of strength, perfection, superiority, or complete independence. Every interaction is filtered through that image because they believe it is the only version of themselves worthy of acceptance. To step outside of that carefully constructed identity means risking something they have spent their entire lives trying to avoid. It means admitting they are insecure. It means acknowledging fear instead of pretending they are always in control. It means allowing someone to witness their shame, their self-doubt, their loneliness, and the painful wounds they have hidden behind confidence or arrogance. For someone whose entire emotional survival has depended on avoiding vulnerability, that experience can feel less like honesty and more like emotional exposure. This is why genuine accountability is so difficult. Real accountability isn't simply saying, "I'm sorry," because those words can be spoken without changing anything inside. It means accepting responsibility without immediately blaming someone else. It means sitting with the discomfort of knowing they caused pain without rushing to defend themselves or rewrite the story. It requires them to tolerate feelings of guilt, regret, and imperfection instead of escaping those emotions through denial, projection, or manipulation. The tragedy is that many people trapped in this pattern are not incapable of feeling emotional pain. In fact, they often experience it very intensely. The problem is that they have never developed healthy ways to process those feelings. Instead, they learn to protect themselves by building an identity that always appears confident, untouchable, or superior. That protective shell may have once helped them survive earlier experiences of rejection, criticism, or emotional neglect, but over time, it becomes a prison. The very defenses that were meant to protect them eventually prevent them from forming the deep, honest connections they secretly long for. For most people caught in this pattern, stepping beyond that false self is not a small request. It asks them to dismantle the psychological structure that has defined their relationships, their self-image, and their sense of security for years. That is an enormous challenge, and many never choose to face it. Some continue protecting the image at the cost of every meaningful relationship they have. Others move from one relationship to the next, repeating the same cycle because changing would require confronting parts of themselves they have spent a lifetime avoiding. And that is why lasting change is so rare. Not because it is impossible, but because it demands a level of honesty, humility, and sustained self-reflection that many people are either unwilling or emotionally unprepared to embrace. Genuine transformation is possible, but only when someone becomes more committed to knowing the truth about themselves than to protecting the image they have created. So the work, as much as it feels unfair, ends up being yours to do without them. Grieving the relationship you thought you had, not just the person. Untangling your own self-worth from the crumbs of attention you were trained to treat as abundance. Relearning what stability actually feels like, because if you were with someone like this for long enough, calm might have started to feel boring and chaos might have started to feel like passion. That confusion is common, and it fades with time and distance, even if it doesn't feel like it will right now. One more thing worth saying clearly: none of this means you were foolish for falling for it. The tactics involved, the love bombing, the sudden withdrawal, the way affection and neglect get mixed together until you can't tell which one is coming next, these aren't things most people are equipped to recognize in real time, especially not from someone who seemed at first like exactly what you'd been hoping for. Recognizing the pattern now doesn't mean you should have seen it then. It means you're paying attention now, which is the part that actually matters. If there's a single idea I'd want you to walk away with, it's this. Someone who only wants you when you're walking away was never really choosing you. They were chasing the feeling of not having you. And the moment that feeling disappeared, so would their interest, regardless of who you turned out to be. That's not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of a system in them that was broken long before you arrived and isn't yours to fix. Let them wonder where you went. Let them notice the silence. You don't owe anyone access to your energy just because they've suddenly remembered they missed the reaction they used to get from you. Keep walking toward whatever life you're building on the other side of this, and don't look back to check if they've noticed. That part isn't your responsibility anymore. Take care of yourself, keep healing, keep moving forward, and I'll see you in the next one.